Hi, everyone. It's Janice, host of the Divorcing Religion podcast. Thanks for tuning into my show, whether you're joining me on audio or video. I've heard from some folks recently who have told me just how much the show has meant, and some of them have even found it not only to be life-changing, but life-saving, as they felt there was no one else who understood what they were going through, and they found the Divorcing Religion podcast, and they started feeling encouraged. Please help me keep my show on the air. Become a member by clicking the join button on the Conference on Religious Trauma YouTube channel. Hey everyone, welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious trauma recovery coach. My guest today is author and cult survivor Richard A. Kiers. Richard was born in Canada to Dutch parents. When he was 10, Richard's parents joined a group called The Move and relocated their family to a commune in British Columbia in 1972. It turned out that The Move was a cult, at one time boasting 40,000 members. Richard wrote a book about his cult experience called Swindled by Faith, A Time for Reconciliation. In Richard's own words, I lived there for only a few short years when I realized I had to leave or die. I have spent the rest of my life learning to be me. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I understand that you're in Canada now. I'm in British Columbia, and I think you might be also.
I'm actually in Edmonton.
Oh, you're in Edmonton. Very
That's
nice. Correct. Yeah. Well, I was quite curious to learn about your story. I think I maybe saw you on Facebook. And please tell us about it. I had never heard of The Move, but I do know there were a lot of communes in BC back in the 70s. So please tell us some of your story.
Well, speaking of the amount of communes, there actually was 8 specific farms up in northern British Columbia at the time that we moved up there. But there were farms and communities all over the United States and South America and many, many different places in the world at the time. But how my story started was at the age of 10, we had been in the Christian Reformed Church, which is a very strict church. They're very devoted to what they believe, and they have their routines. And it was, I think generally it was just because we were Dutch and we lived in a Dutch community. We went to a Dutch church, and they had services in English and in Dutch so that they could basically accommodate the older people and the younger people. And it was our home. It was where we grew up, and all of our friends were there. Our school was a private school that was connected to the church, and so it was a very isolated world as well. Basically community oriented. Basically a community church. And our community that we lived in Ontario was pretty well a Dutch community. So our neighbors were Dutch, our friends were Dutch. The school we went to was basically Dutch, all Dutch kids pretty much. The church was all Dutch people. And it was just, it was our family and our community. When I was 10, my dad went down to Florida or to South Carolina actually, and met, I have no idea how he discovered this group, but he met with Sam Fife and some of the Sam Fife followers, who Sam was the leader of the group. And when he came back, he just informed us that we were leaving our school and our church and our community. And in a very short period of time, we were told that we were no longer allowed to have friends that were outside of the new group. All of our friends had to be abandoned. Some of my mom and dad's family, so aunts and uncles, sort of kind of participated with mom and dad at the beginning, so we didn't really lose touch with all of them right away, but over time they saw through it and they left, and then all of a sudden we were told that they were all evil and bad and we couldn't have anything to do with them anymore. And then the next thing you know, Sam Fife had this epiphany that everybody had to move to northern British Columbia, everybody from our group, and live on a commune. And of course, mom and dad and all the people that were in our group in Ontario just swallowed that all up, and we all packed up, sold our places, and moved. And once we got to the commune, it was total isolation. We were on a farm where We had no access to the outside world. We had no television, no radio, no nothing, no newspaper services, nothing. It was just exclusively us and no part of the world. So it suddenly became we became a family group, and that was our only family. And the outside world no longer existed in our minds and in our life.
And how many people were there on that commune, do you think?
Originally, when we went, I think there was about 4 or 5 families that moved up there together. By the time I left, there was quite a few more. I'm not exactly sure how many people anymore. Some of the farms got up to over 200 people. Some of them were a little bit smaller. The general community in northern BC became very large. There were a lot of people involved in it. There were several farms, but eventually some of the farms were sold and they kind of merged everyone together. And as it grew, like now, I think in 2024, I believe there's maybe 2 or 3 farms left. That's it. The rest of them have all been sold off, and they've just become smaller and smaller. But their population is dying out as well. So this group will no longer exist in another 15 or 20 years because it's just disappearing.
And was the teaching different? The teaching that you were hearing from Sam Fife, as opposed to the teaching, I mean, how much did you pay attention when you were 10 years old? But the teaching that went on in the Canadian Reformed Church, or the CanRef, or however you call it, how different was it? Was this someone who was charismatic, and was there that element to it?
Sam was extremely charismatic, yes, and the group, the philosophy, the ideology was completely different than the Christian Reformed Church. Like, it was not anything like it at all. There was we became born again Christians, which the Christian Reformed Church has no part of. We became, like even baptism was in the Christian Reformed Church. They sprinkle a little water on the baby's head and you're baptized into the church, and it's a few papers you sign and now you're a church member. Whereas in our group, it was full submersion. You had to be literally put under the water. And we were even told, like, if accidentally one finger or a strand of hair didn't get under the water when you went under, then it didn't take and you had to do it again. And it was so also the philosophy of the Christian Reformed Church was very family oriented, but it was focused on your own family. They were very family oriented. And I remember, like you say, a lot of people at the age of 10 were not really into. I paid a lot of attention. I was very, very interested in what was going on. I was extremely excited about going into this new group. And I was completely in. I played the game. I did everything they told me to do. I tried my best to be the best Movite that I could possibly be. And it just ended up not being for me. But the philosophy, the ideology was so completely different. It was like night and day.
Okay. And how long were you there before you started to see that something wasn't right, or it wasn't what you hoped it would be?
Well, we drove up. When we drove up in 1972, I celebrated my 12th birthday on the trip up. And in fact, I was in a little town called Parry Sound when my Northern Ontario, when I had my 12th birthday. And when we arrived at the farm, there were no roads into the actual farm itself. There was part way in, but not all the way in. So we had to build all these roads. We did that all by hand. And we had to build a bridge and to cross a creek. And then we had to build all these log cabins. And we only had one summer to get this done before winter because everybody was living in trailers and tents, and it was just ridiculous. But that summer, we were living in a campsite on a farm, a neighbor's farm. We actually set up our trailers in the north end of their farm. And my dad became very ill. And when he was ill, he was moaning and crying, and days this went on. And we were told basically that his faith was being tested, and if he didn't live, it was God, just that was the way it was. And he most likely, I remember even being told that he likely would not live because his faith was not strong enough to get through this. But my dad did survive it. But that's when my faith pretty much ended. I just could not believe that there was a God that would, they refused to take him to the doctor. And we were coming from a society where if you needed something, you went to the hospital, you went to the doctor. I had an older sister that was very sick when she was younger. She spent months and months and lots of time in the hospital, in and out and in and out. And that was the way we were brought up, was doctors took care of you. And so this was very strange to me. It didn't make any sense. And that's when my faith really became shaken. And from that point on, I just became less and less interested in what they were teaching and more interested in finding a way out. And I was only 12 when that happened. So,
wow, that type of insular environment that's so completely cut off, where they don't even allow people to go to doctors and receive medical help. This is how children die. This is how people die. If a kid is born into that environment and they're diabetic, they are not going to survive. That's horrifying to me that was going on. And I'm sure if we took a look into the history, we would see that there were some people who died when they were part of that movement because they rejected help.
We absolutely had one particular situation that I know of when I was still on the farm. One of the other farms, a gentleman, a young family man with young kids and a wife, he was filling a gas lantern with gas, and he pumped it up and it blew up in his face.
Oh, dear.
And he ended up with third-degree burns on his face and his hands and his chest and everywhere on his body. And they just refused to take him to the hospital, and they would not take him. And they kept sending messages to our farm, pray harder, pray harder, pray harder. We need more faith. We need more this. We need more that. And he ended up dying. And he never went to a doctor. And, they built a pine box for him and buried him in the back of the farm. I mean,
wow.
So yeah, that stuff did happen, and it happened because they refused medical help, right?
Well, and so does that factor in? I read your statement earlier, something to the effect of you realized if you didn't go, you might die. If you didn't leave the farm, was it that reasoning that they weren't even getting people help when they needed help, or what's behind that statement?
Behind that statement for me was I had become very depressed, and I actually became suicidal. And I had decided to end my life, and I actually attempted to end my life, and but I failed. And when it failed, that was the moment that I realized that I didn't want to end my life. I just didn't want that life anymore, and I needed to find a way out. I needed to get away, and nobody was listening to me. And I tried talking to my parents; they wouldn't listen, and other people in the group wouldn't listen. I had no choice. I had to choose to leave, and I chose to leave. So.
Wow. And how old were you then when you did leave?
I was 15 when I left.
And how did you leave? Did anybody know you were going? Did you talk to a sibling or a friend, or?
Yeah, I told my mom and dad the night before that I was leaving, and my mother laughed at me, and she made some off the cuff comment about they're going to change your diaper and send you home. And then I went outside and stood out on the front porch of the house with my dad, and we talked for a while, and I told him I had to leave. I couldn't do it. I couldn't be there anymore. And he told me he that's fine. I'm not going to try to stop you. But he said, I just want you to know that within a very short period of time, he had said a month or two, I would become a drug addict, and I would probably die on the streets as a drug addict and be an alcoholic, and everything bad was going to happen to me. And I told this story before, and the reality of it is in my case, I don't know what your religion or cult had taught you about hell, but we were taught that hell was a pretty scary place, and that going there was someplace you never wanted to go because it was eternity. There was never an ending, and you would never actually, your soul would live there forever, and you'd be burning, and your skin would be melting off, and yada, yada, and all this stuff that was terrible. But when I decided to leave, I actually made a conscious choice that I would rather go to hell than stay on the farm. And that was a pretty scary choice to make, but nothing was going to stop me anymore. And it turned out that this big bad world wasn't as bad as they said it was going to be. So
I'm amazed at your strength to determine in your middle teens. Like, you were not a full-grown adult. You were a teenager, and you recognized what was going on was so unhealthy and so dangerous. And I mean, when we're talking about charismatic cult leaders, and they're often narcissistic, very controlling. There can be other forms of abuse that are also taking place in these commune type situations. You knew that you had to get out. How did you leave? Did you just get on a bike? Did you just walk into town? Like, what do you do when you're 15 years old?
Well, from our houses where our houses were built to the highway across country through the woods was about 3.5 miles. And the morning that I decided to leave, I actually just packed a shoebox with a few things. I put in a pair of jeans and a couple of a shirt and some socks and some underwear. And I just put that under my arm and I started walking. One of the couples that lived on the farm saw me leaving and they called me into their house to say goodbye to me because they were very supportive, nice people. And they're no longer in the move anymore. They left a long time ago too. But they gave me a suitcase, a little gray suitcase. So I was able to put my stuff in this little gray suitcase when I left.
Yeah.
And then I walked across the frozen river. It was about just a little colder than 30 below outside when
my
I walked
God,
out.
this was in wintertime yet.
Yeah, it was February. And I walked out up the hill. And when I got to the other side, I was probably about a half a mile away from the farm. And it's uphill all the way to the highway. So it was quite getting quite high. And I turned around and looked back and I saw, like I was saying, I saw the smoke coming from the cabin chimneys. And in the cold, that really accentuates itself. Like the smoke really comes up nice and just floating into the air. No wind, no nothing. And it was just a scene of absolute beauty. Like it was just a gorgeous Christmas scene. But you don't see what's going on inside. You don't see the turmoil and the hurt and the pain and the control that's happening within that group when you see that beauty, right? It was pretty early in the morning too. So it was a nice day, crystal clear day. And yeah, it was like 1,000,000 tons were lifted off my back. I walked away from there and I just floated up the hill the rest of the way. And that was it.
Wow.
It was a great feeling.
Oh, I'm so glad. I thought maybe you were going to say it was tugging at your heart, but you were like, nope, it's good for me to be leaving. And so what did you do? 15 years old, you don't know anybody in town, I'm presuming.
Well, I actually did. There was a couple that had left the farm earlier, and they earlier that year, and they were living in town in Fort St. John, BC. And I went to their house and I had told them that I was going to Edmonton. And I had made arrangements about Edmonton. Like I had it all planned. I had a couple basically a couple in Edmonton that I had spoken to that they were prepared to take me in, and I lived with them for the first almost a year, I think, that I was there.
Wonderful.
He gave me my first job. They took really good care of me. They were really good people, but they were kind of 1 foot in the move and 1 foot out. So I was able to be there without actually having to be involved with the move. I went to some of the move meetings in Edmonton every so often because that was my world. All my friends were there, like everybody I knew that was there. So it was a transition for me that kind of was, leaving that age. If I would have had to be on the street, I probably wouldn't have survived. Mm-hmm. But I had resources that I could tap into that I did tap into, and things worked out fine for me. There were a lot of people that left after me that didn't have that, and they just kind of had to struggle and try to make it on their own. Mm-hmm. I think the floodgates pretty well opened up after I left. There was lots of people that left after that. So individual younger people, right?
Right.
Before I left, mostly it was couples that had left. I had an older brother that had already left, but he didn't leave the move. He was living in one of the communal houses in Edmonton at the time, but I couldn't stay there because I was no longer in the move. So I couldn't stay with them.
But you could have contact with him. Were you writing letters to home?
We went out. We went swimming together. We did all kinds of things together. We eventually ended up with an apartment together. So yeah, that was fine. It worked out. He's no longer involved in that either. He left shortly thereafter as well. Everybody became wiser over time and realized how foolish this thing was.
Well, can you give us some insight into what was it about being there that just was so was so heavy on you, really caused you to be quite depressed? Was it being cut off from the outside world? Was it teachings that were going on? Was it the abuse that was happening? What was it that made you come to such a significant decision that you at 15 years old had to leave?
I think it was very much abuse. There was physical abuse and there was psychological abuse that was absolutely unbelievable. The story
From Fife, from Sam
right,
Fife.
well, from the leadership, not
Okay.
just Fife, but I mean, they were so strict, and the rules were made by Fife and his upper group of people, but the rules were enforced by the elders on the farm. So, but if you take listen to the story that I just told you about my dad when my dad was so sick, those types of things that was abuse. That I had younger siblings that were told the same thing as I was told, that my dad was probably not going to live and he didn't have enough faith and all this kind of stuff. Can you imagine the psychological effect that has on a child? I had younger siblings that, 2, 4, and 6 years younger than me. So I don't know how much of that they remember because I was pretty young, but I'm sure that at the time that must have hurt, really, really hurt. Like, that's a psychological way of hurting someone, right? But then when you progressed on, all sorts of things happened over and over and over again. And everything was about, if you didn't, like, we worked from the time the sun came up to the sun came down. And if you're from Canada, which you are, especially you get north, that can be a long day.
Mm-hmm.
And because we had cabins to get built before the snow flew. We had like 4 months to do all of this. We had to cut the logs. We had to, strip the bark off the logs. We had to build the cabins. We had to build the road. We had to build the farm. We had to get land ready for growing crops, pull the weeds, plant vegetables, grow them. It just never ended. So you would get up in the morning, go to work, eat, sleep, work, eat, sleep, work, eat,
Wow.
sleep, work.
And this is child labor.
And as kids, I don't think they realized how difficult it was for kids. Mm-hmm. We had no choice. We had to work. And so you would get so tired that you'd go to bed at night and you'd cry yourself to sleep because you were so tired, but just to get up in the morning and go back to work again. Mm-hmm. And we were lucky. We did get Sundays off. And Sunday was more of a church day. So you went to church in the morning, you went to church again in the evening, and you kind of were able to relax a little bit during the day and take some time off. But certain things like chores, especially once we had pigs and cows and chickens and stuff, that all had to be done. And in the haying season, you didn't necessarily get Sunday off because you only had limited weather to get the fields off. You have to harvest the potatoes and the turnips and everything. You couldn't leave that for a Sunday. You had to work. So there were many Sundays that were work days too. So you really didn't get a lot of time off. And that was kind of, in my opinion, it was psychological and physical abuse of kids.
Yes. Was there school going on?
Well, we kind of went to school. We did some BC correspondence courses on the farm because the government said we had to do school. It was very limited, and we did a little bit, but not very much. But school was not important, and working on the farm was. So I think we did what the government said we had to do minimum, and that was about it. But it was painful. It was constant. And then I had a scenario when I was 14 years old. There was a young lady that we had some puppy love going on, mm-hmm. which happens when you're normal kids, right?
Yeah.
And it was discovered, and the father of this girl went in and told the elders that he had received a word from God that I was a homosexual. And being gay in the move was probably just about the worst possible thing you could be, because it was a direct ticket to hell, and there was no redemption from that whatsoever. And so I got dragged into this meeting with the elders, and they accused me of being gay, and he gave his reasons why he believed I was gay. And nobody defended me, not even my dad. Like, he just sat there and kind of, oh, really? And I just, it created a big problem for me, because for many, many years, I had a really serious problem with my sexual identity, because I knew that I wasn't gay, mm-hmm. but God said that I was gay.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so for me, for years, I struggled with that for a long time. And I ended up being sexually assaulted by a man. Mm-hmm. And when that happened, it made things 10 times worse.
Right.
And he was one of the men from the farm. Mm-hmm. So that there was scenario after scenario that just drives the depression and drives the anguish, and you end up feeling eventually so worthless and useless. And there was the farm had started sending young boys out to work because they found out they needed money to continue going.
Mm-hmm.
So these guys would go work for logging companies and stuff, and they were they'd get paid, and the check would go to the farm, right? And I had asked over and over if I could do it, and my dad just kept saying, "You're not going, and you're never going. We're never going to let you go." So I ended up going to another farm for a few weeks. I don't remember exactly how long it was. This is a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
But I went to another farm, and they tried to really, really hard to rehabilitate me and get me back on track. And it just didn't work. Like I couldn't be changed anymore. I was headed down the doomed highway,
Wow. Yeah,
So,
boy, when I think of how confusing our adolescence often is and can be anyway, in the very best of circumstances, and then to consider the situation that you just described and how that simply would add to confusion. And then, of course, they add morality, immorality, that whole thing they throw. And I mean, obviously, we know that consensual sex, it's fine. It's wonderful. And however that turns out to be, but not in religious groups. Sex is only allowed to be one way between a married man and his wife. That's how it has to be. There's no room for anything else. Anything else is labeled with terrible labels. And then your dad doesn't even say a word in your defense, doesn't stand up for you, tells you that you can't even ever leave. I mean, why? Why, if they knew you were struggling and suffering, why wouldn't they let you go? Had the group and leadership hijacked his thinking and his compassion to that degree?
I have come to terms with what my mom and dad did because I believe that mom and dad didn't do it on purpose. I believe that they actually thought they were doing absolutely the right thing. All their whole life, they thought they were doing the right thing. I hold the group responsible for that. I hold the teachings responsible for that. If Sam Fife were alive today, I'd probably have a piece of my mind to give to him, but he's gone. The thing is, though, that my parents, one of the things that if you understand cults and you understand how they work, it's one thing to say, if they knew that this was going on, why would they tell you can't leave? Well, they didn't know what was going on because we never talked about anything. And nothing was ever talked about. And if you tried to talk about it, you were shut down. You were told that never happened, or you were told, we don't discuss that, or, but we were trained to believe certain things, like boys and girls couldn't swim in the same swimming hole together because girls would get pregnant. I never knew what they meant.
Gosh.
I never knew that they meant that if we seen a girl in her swimming suit, we would crawl into the woods somewhere and make her pregnant. I thought it meant that if we swam in the swimming pool, she'd get pregnant.
Right.
Like, that's basically what we were taught. You couldn't ice skate together. We couldn't do anything as co-ed. Like, it just could not be done. When I became older, I realized that it was just a bunch of dirty old men that had it in their minds that they could never have done that. And when you think about it, my dad and my mom was pregnant before she got married. And that was all hush, hush, hush. And I didn't even know that until we figured it out when they were much older. And then my dad's response was, "Oh, we only did it once." Like as if that makes any difference. And so you end up in a situation where nothing is ever discussed, nothing's talked about, because you have the rules, the rules, and you have to follow the rules, and you're expected to follow the rules. And if you start talking about, if, for example, you have feelings for, if I, as a young man, had feelings for a girl, and I told anybody that I would have those feelings, they wouldn't have talked to me as though that was okay. I would have been punished for having those feelings. So you never told anybody. You had to sneak around. You had to hide behind a building when it got dark at night just to stand and talk to each other like normal human beings.
Wow.
And
it's so intrusive.
I remember the first time that one of the girls that I was talking to, it wasn't the one that I really liked, but because she had been shipped off to another farm. They separated us. They put us away. But there was another girl that I was talking to that we were just friends, and I remember standing around the corner of this eating building in the evening when it was dark, and she reached out and touched my hand. And I remember that feeling when she touched my hand, like it was a shock. And you're terrified because it's so against God's will, and you're standing there and you're just freaked out, like it was unbelievable. And I never let that happen to me again for years after that. I was just, and it shouldn't be like that. A 14-year-old child should be able to start venturing out and feeling those feelings and learning about love and learning about how to respect each other and understand each other's feelings. And it's not necessarily going to be the person you fall in love with and spend the rest of your life with, but you develop relationships and you learn how to have a relationship. We never learned any of that on the farm. I had a failed marriage. Not that there was other reasons why it failed, but I didn't know how to deal with the situations that we were confronted with. I dealt with them in my own way that I thought was the best way, but I never learned any of that stuff. I didn't know anything about relationships. Mm-hmm. And I'm learning that now. I have lots of love in my life now, and it's absolutely fantastic. It feels better than it's ever felt, and it's getting better with age. But these groups, the torture in terms of the psychological, we talk about sexual abuse. It happens. And there's no doubt that it happened in our group as well. But in our group, there was a lot more of the physical, psychological abuse than there was of the sexual. There was some sexual abuse, absolutely. And when it happened, all they did was separated the people and moved them to different farms. They never talked about it. They never did anything about it. It was just a cover up every time. So I think I've interviewed probably over 100. I've interviewed over 100 people already for my new book. And I've got a bunch more that are, they're coming out of the woodwork right now. Everybody wants to talk about it, and I'm happy because I want people to talk about it. But the common denominator is the fact that every one of them tells me that, yes, sexual things happened, but honestly, even though we think that's the worst abuse that there is, it's not. Because it happens, you deal with it. Yes, you're hurt. It bothers you for the rest of your life, but it hurts. But we're forgetting about how painful the other abuses are. Physical abuse, if you're beat up all the time when you're a kid, it sticks with you so bad for the rest of your life. It's unbelievable. You don't trust anyone. You hear loud noises. You have tremors. You're scared all the time. That is terrible. So not belittling sexual abuse, that's absolutely disgusting and terrible. But the other abuses are just as bad. And they affect you just the same way. And psychological abuse might even be the worst, because of the fact that you live your whole life in fear, when this should be a wonderful life where we can be happy and enjoy it. We've been given an opportunity that is unbelievable to be here on earth. And we have to live with fear because some jackass told us that, oh my God, that's wrong.
Right. Yes.
It's disgusting.
You're preaching to the choir. You've got that absolutely right. And I do want to give a shout out, just as we're talking about sex and adolescence and religion. Next year, I'm hosting the Shameless Sexuality Life After Purity Culture Conference in Seattle. It's the first time we're having this live event. And people can go to shamelesssexuality.org to learn more about that. And what you're just mentioning, Richard, talking about physical abuse, talking about psychological abuse and sexual abuse, the psychological stuff kind of undergirds everything when we're in situations like that, because we're taught we're bad. We're taught that we need a savior. We're taught that our very thoughts are dirty. Even just these natural impulses, touching someone's hand, that's should be a sweet memory, but it just was filled with terror and angst because of the things that you were indoctrinated to believe. And I'm so thrilled to hear you say that now, as you continue getting older, that life is richer. Your relationships, they feel so much better. There's lots of love in your life, as you mentioned, but it takes a while. We are like this when we leave those difficult situations, all clenched up and closed off, and we got to protect ourselves. And it takes quite a while, and often working with a therapist, just being with very compassionate people for us to start to let our guard down and experience the beautiful feelings that can also be part of relating to other people.
Absolutely. And what I'm finding now too is that I'm trying very hard to help people, and I'm trying very hard to reach out. So I've written the book Swindled by Faith, which is my story from the age of about 10 to 17. Now I'm writing a new book, and it's called Silent Voices, which is the same name as what my podcast is going to be, and it's the same name as my Facebook page. And I'm really trying to, number one, I kind of break down the cults, and I talk about many different cults in there and how they all compare with each other and how they're all so similar, things to watch out for. And then I talk about the cult leaders of many of these groups and what actually makes a leader and how they develop from where they came from to where they are and how they become so powerful. And then I start talking to individuals, and my book is very much about the individual. I'm trying not to make it about the groups. I want to focus on individual people and their experiences in the group, before, in the group, and after the group. And I have discovered so many people that were kids that were born there or that were brought there as kids, and they've ended up leaving and now they're in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and they've been leading fairly normal lives most of their life, and they're still so traumatized, it's unbelievable. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen to kids in other things. I mean, when we talk about athletics and sports and stuff, there's all kinds of abuse that goes in there that traumatize people for life. But it should never happen in the group that is supposed to be your moral foundation. The people that you trust completely, the people that you're asked to trust and that you should be able to trust. I know of certain churches, like I won't mention the names of any churches, but I know of some churches that they're very welcoming to everybody. And if you leave, you leave. If you come back. They have open arms to you all the time. And yes, they treat you very well. There's other churches that you have to sign a piece of paper that now you're becoming a member, and you got to go through all their rituals, and you got to go through all this stuff. And if you try to leave, oh my God, like it's the biggest trauma in the world. I remember when my parents left the Christian Reformed Church, I mean, there were elders from the Christian Reformed Church coming to our house and sitting down with mom and dad in the living room and telling them how wrong they were. And you got to come back and you got to change this and you're making a mistake. And yeah, maybe they saw something that we didn't see, but that church was the same when it came to not wanting people to leave.
Oh, yeah. Everybody thinks they have the secret sauce.
Exactly.
Every group thinks that.
I was talking to someone this morning, ironically, about God. And we were talking about the fact that God what's so interesting about God is that if you're born in India, you become a Hindu or you become something. If you're born in China, you're probably going to be a Buddhist or something to that effect. If you're born in North America or Europe, you're probably going to be Christian. You're born into it. So how can anyone say my God is the right God?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and everybody does. They all say their God is the right God.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just ridiculous. Like, come on, there's if there is a God, then there can only be one. And if that's the case, then who's wrong? Nobody knows, right?
Oh, and I mean, it's so interesting to look back through time, and there were people who believed Poseidon and Thor and, whoever else were as real as Christians believe God and Jesus to be today. Those people believed they were real, but now we just say, oh, that's mythology.
Yes, but reality of it is that, when you look at 14,000 years ago, when religion first started to make headway, there was no Jehovah. Jehovah
Right.
and God only happened 2,000 years ago. But there were all of the gods, and ironically is that when religion first started, every single god was a goddess. They were all female. There was no male god, and that until even another 4,000 years closer to us now was the first introduction of the male gods, and there was many of them. There were god after god that were male, but the female gods came first. And then religion comes in, the modern day religion that we understand comes in around 2000, which is, Christianity through Jesus being born, and Christianity gets born. the Old Testament, during the whole entire time of the Old Testament, there was no such thing as Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
They believed in a God, but it never talks about Christianity being the religion of that time.
Mm-hmm.
It was a God. It was the God of Judea. It was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But it doesn't talk about it being Christianity. It only became Christianity when Jesus was born. So
Right.
understanding religion and understanding where it comes from all of a sudden opens up this broad picture of, wow, like this is something way bigger than we could ever imagine. And that's, we were talking earlier about where do I stand when it comes to God?
Mm-hmm.
That's where I see there's a broad spectrum that none of us are capable of even understanding with our puny little brains. So it's big. It's big.
I'm curious if your parents stayed members of the move. Did they stay there until the end of their lives, or what? Did they ever realize, oh, we've been in a cult this whole time?
Well, you know what's crazy is my dad gave up everything that he had. Every dime that he had went to the church, and they even sucked him out for more. When the farm that my dad purchased was in my dad's name because he bought it, they actually forced him to sign that over to the group, and then they moved them off of the farm to a different farm. So dad had to give that up too. And then when mom and dad became older, the group had a trailer park that was in the middle of nowhere up the Alaska Highway, and they built a church, and they put all these trailers around this church, and then they everybody that became pretty much useless on the farms, couldn't do the work anymore, couldn't do this, they eventually moved those people to that trailer park. Mom and dad had a pension, so they were able to eventually save enough money. They bought their own trailer and they owned it. And my dad was very proud. He fixed it all up and made it into a really nice home for them. And but they never left the group. They stayed in the group till the day they died. And
wow.
they were completely devoted to it. In fact, my mother was, I don't know what your religion was like, but when they had a church service, someone would get up and lead the singing. In other words, stand up and get everyone to sing the songs and all this stuff. Well, my mother was up doing that, and she had a stroke and died right in the church.
Wow.
So she actually, she ended up in the hospital, and she was on life support, and she never came back.
Oh, they did send her to the hospital.
They took her to the hospital, yeah. And she never recovered from that. And then 4 years or so later, I think it was about 4 years later, my dad passed away with cancer. And but he was so lonely. He missed her so much. And I remember my sister telling me that when mom passed away, she was staying in a hotel. My dad had the hotel room next to her, and she said he just wailed and cried all night long. And I can understand partly. In our group, in the move, we were told we would live forever. God had chosen the people, they would live forever. They were going to never die. And then when Sam Fife died, Sam had already told everyone that he would, if he ever died, he was a false prophet. I heard him say that myself. He said it in front of 10,000 people. And then a couple of years later, he ended up crashing his airplane and dying. So, but when my brother asked my dad, he said, so now does that prove that Sam's a false prophet? My dad just told him, oh, no. Sam just became so perfect that God had to take him from this earth because he was too good. And so the gaslighting starts, right? And it was just completely ridiculous. I remember my brother saying that to my dad, and my brother just laughing. And my dad was quite upset that we would even think about asking such a question, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it was so I imagine that my dad was laying there when my mom passed away and thinking everything he believed in was wrong.
Right.
But he never acted on it because he stayed in the group till the day he died. So
right. And did all your siblings leave? Did some stay in?
Every one of them eventually left. In fact, I have one sister that was actually born on the farm, and she left when she was 18. And she's done really well for herself. Those are the ones that I was always the most concerned about because they didn't know anything about the outside world.
Right. They didn't have a before.
Yeah. So they had no before. So they had nothing to check it out with. But she's done really well for herself. She's very brilliant, smart woman, great job, does really well. And I'm quite impressed that she's done as well as she has. So,
wow. Do you know if your siblings have read your book? Did you talk with them when you were writing your book? Your first one?
well, since I wrote the book, none of them talked to me. So,
Oh no, I'm
yeah,
sorry.
the story, they would have preferred that the story was never told, but
Right.
I needed to do it. It was for me, and I will live with the consequences of it.
Mhm.
I do know that one of my sisters did confront me after the book and said, "Why did you say this, 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 and this?" And I said, "I never said that. Like, in fact, I said exactly the opposite." So I realized then that she had never even read the book. She was just listening
Right.
to something someone else said.
Mm.
And I haven't heard from her since. So
Mhm.
and it's been over 5 years now since I've spoken to
Wow.
anyone in the family. So
Right. Do you, I'm sorry that your siblings have had that response. What has your response been like from people who have read the book? Do you hear from anyone who's read it or?
I hear from so many people that have read this book, you have no idea. In fact, I get email after email after email from people that read the book that are so pleased that they read this book. And the majority of them, and not unlike yourself, I'm positive that when you first got out of it, you felt like you were the only one and you felt like you were alone.
Mm-hmm.
And this really opened up the possibility that there could be other people out there. And so people have read the book. They you know, I don't know what I wrote in the book that upset my family so bad. I really don't. But whatever the case, it doesn't really matter. But the the point is that people listen. They read the book and they know, they can feel, because they've been through it and they understand it, and they're looking at it and saying, I've had emails from tons of people that have said, "Thank you so much for reading this book." I have I have relatives in Ontario that have read the book that have said to me, now they have such a better understanding of what actually
Right.
happened. Like,
Yes.
they didn't even know what happened. And part of the book, in the book, I also describe what I went back to Ontario years after I was an adult, and I went to see some of my dad's former friends, and I actually almost interviewed them. And I wanted to know what happened in my dad's life that made my dad flip the switch and change. And the one friend of my dad's was one of my dad's best friends, and we sat down and he told me, he said, "Your dad was never really happy in the Christian Reformed Church." And part of the reason dad wasn't happy was because my dad had this idea of morality and what morality should look like. And they had moved from Holland to Canada in 1956. And the reason they came to Canada wasn't, it was because they wanted a better life, but it was also because Europe was going so, like the hippie movement, it was in the 50s, prostitution was being legalized. All the girls were wearing skirts that were too
Mhm.
short, and boys were growing long hair. And oh my
Mhm.
God. So they came to Canada hoping that being in the the Christian Reformed Church, it would be a strict enough environment and that Canada wasn't going to let that immoral world come in. It only took a few years, and the next thing, and Canada was in the same boat. So then my dad continued looking for something that those moral standards were kept up. And this group that we went into was so strict, it was unbelievable. Like, the girls had to wear dresses that were a certain length, and the boys weren't allowed to have facial hair, and your hair had to be cut short, and you had to wear, certain clothes wasn't allowed, and certain clothes was allowed. And like, it was just so many rules, 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 rules. And my dad thrived on rules. He liked to
Mhm.
have that order in his life. And
Mhm.
so that's why my dad was so attracted to this group.
Mm.
And I don't know for sure that he ever really realized, even to the day he died, that he had really screwed up and made a mistake.
Right. Boy, I feel like I can relate to your dad. And I grew up in a home with a very volatile, narcissistic, fundamentalist father. So for me, I felt safe in rules. If I could learn the rules and maybe memorize the rules, then maybe I'd be safer. And then I grew up in a Pentecostal home, and then I married a man who wanted to become a pastor. And then I discovered Haldeman Mennonites. They're a closed Mennonite group. And lo and behold, even more rules for me to follow. So I just hook, line, and sinker went down that rabbit hole, started wearing a head covering, no makeup, no jewelry, wouldn't cut my daughter's hair, homeschooled the children, just kept getting more and more conservative. And my husband at the time, he was he was wise on this point. He said, Jan, how small are you going to make your circle? I'm watching you make your circle smaller and smaller. And pretty darn small was how it turned out. There was only room for me in there in the end, but it's like I was driven, I was consumed by rules and rule following. And so then when I lost my faith, it was a very big deal. The pendulum swung in the complete opposite direction. We just have a few minutes left. Oh, and so please tell us again the name of both of your books. I know you've written, I think, quite a few books, but a couple specifically that are dealing with this topic.
I have one that's specific with this, which is called Swindled by Faith. And it is an autobiography of my life from the age of 10 to the age of 17, which kind of outlines everything we've talked about. And then I have the second one is called Silent Voices, which basically is just telling the story of other people. It's not so much focused on me. It's focused on other people and the effect that this has had on their lives. And then I have the podcast that I'm starting up probably within the next couple of weeks. I'm just learning the editing features and stuff, and I'm trying to get all of that down pat before I try to get too serious about doing it. But I've interviewed over 100 people on Zoom, and what bothers me about that is I didn't record any of it because I just took notes and wrote because I had promised everybody, like, this is confidential between us. But most of them have come back to me now and said, if you get a podcast, we'd love to do this on podcast. And I'm thinking, well, that's fabulous. Maybe I've probably got a year's worth of podcasts I can do without even having to go find anybody to talk to. So I'm quite pleased with that. So
wow,
so
and
that's where that goes.
Those are people from every different kind of religious culty background. Maybe even some that weren't religious cults, or were they all pretty much religious cults?
They're all cults. They're not all religious cults. But one of the people that contacted me within the last couple of weeks is actually someone that's still in the group.
Wow.
And wants me to interview so they can tell their point of view. And I am very interested in doing more of that. And also another area that I'm moving towards, not trying to take too much of your time here, but I want to interview spouses of people that are living with someone that they've been married to for years and years, and how they've had to learn to understand and cope and deal with the trauma that these people have lived with. So that's expanding too. I've had a couple of wives that I've interviewed whose husbands have contacted me and say, hey, I'd like to talk to you too. I want to tell you what it's like living with her because of this and because of the trauma and her family and all the stuff that goes on. So I'm going to do that as well. So I've got my plate pretty full.
Wow.
The one thing I do want to mention quickly too is that I'm also dealing with, I'm trying to get onto a TED Talk. And I've been talking back and forth with them already. And I've also got a public speaking engagement that I'm going to be doing sometime, probably. It was supposed to be in October. I think it's going to be now probably a couple of months from now. But I'll have to go to the States to do that. So I'm prepared to go where I have to do this because, and I'd like to retire by April next year. And then I'm just going to do this full time. And so that's my goal. I don't know if I can make it, but
how can people find you? How can people get in touch with you?
Well, mostly it's Facebook right now. That Facebook page, Silent Voices, is there. And I also have a public, just a page for that as well. I don't currently have a website. I will probably set that up. I'm not a technology person as much as I am a talker. So I have people that are starting to help me put this all together, and it's coming.
Excellent.
And when it happens, we'll put it out there. The point is that I'm not in a position financially where I can just quit working. So I figured that the book sales and everything, again, People Magazine interviewed me, and they flew me to New York for the interview, and they did a documentary on Discovery ID. Yeah. So one of their episodes on Discovery ID is called People Magazine Investigates Cults. And I think it's episode number 5. I'm pretty sure that we're on. And
cool.
And then that was when my first book was released. So my book did very well for the first 6-7 months after it was released. Yeah. And now then I stopped promoting it. I was on all sorts of podcasts. I was on everything. I stopped promoting it. The book sales died off. But now it's all of a sudden picking off again. And I've had so many people saying to me, where do I get it? Where do I get it? And how can I get it? It's available on Amazon. It's available on Barnes and Noble. Indigo Books in Canada they were carrying it in stock, but now it's just online.
Okay.
So it's really easy to get. It's an easy book to find.
Excellent.
And it's not a huge book, but it's definitely a book that gives you an insight into the life that we went through.
It sounds like it.
And I would like people to buy it. Obviously, I mean, because I want to be able to go out. I want this whole thing to be able to financially support itself, so that I can be out there helping other people.
Yes.
And that's my goal, right?
I so appreciate that, and you have a very interesting story. I look forward to reading both of those books that you mentioned, and I will also include that information in the show notes. And I want to thank you, Richard, just for joining me on the Divorcing Religion podcast. It was really nice to meet with you.
Well, thank you very much. And if you ever want to talk again, I'd actually like to hear your story. So we should reverse roles. And once I get my podcast going, I'd like to invite you to come on and we'll reverse roles. I'd like to hear your story as well.
Oh, that would be a pleasure. And thank you, everyone, for joining us on the Divorcing Religion podcast. Take care, everyone. We'll see you again soon.